Our next Adventures in Learning, by the way, is going to be something a little bit different. We're going to go to Eastside Park on June 26th, so it'll be a Friday, and we're going to go to Eastside Park. Part of our program is already set. We're still working on the other part, but Lauren, are you around? Lauren Evinrude actually has kind of helped us put part of the program together where we're going to have the dogs, the pugs. There's Lauren. Lauren, come on up and tell us a little bit about part of our program on June 26th. And like I say, hopefully a nice day like today. We're going to be at Eastside Park. We're going to grill some hot dogs and have a good lunch, and the pugs are coming.
I don't know how much you know about those little ugly dogs that run around. They are therapy dogs. My niece, Maria Ingebretson, lives in Minneapolis, and she has a circle of friends, and they're all pug lovers. And I give her a lot of grief about that because, I tell her humans are more important than animals, so we've got to be careful there. She doesn't like that. But anyway, she's coming on June 26th with Michelle, her good friend, and a whole bunch of other pug lovers. And we're going to meet at the Eastside Park. We're kind of working on the details now, but we're going to try to have transportation available for people who would like to come and spend a morning out at the park watching the pugs and learning about that breed of dog. And they have quite a show they put on. So if you are going to be available on June 26th, we'd like to see you 9:30 over at Eastside Park. And we have hot dogs to wrap up the session. There's another part of the session. I'm not sure what Rod's got planned here, but we hope to see you.
Yes, it's going to be a lot of fun. We're working, actually, I haven't confirmed it yet, so we can't announce it, but if we're working on another real interesting part of the program for June 26th, again, Eastside Park. But, all right, I think we are ready to resume our Adventures in Learning for today. You probably read about our next speaker in magazines or newspapers or seen him before. He's a clinical psychologist with an emphasis on the psychology of aging. He's an author. In fact, some books available. If anybody's interested today, the books for sale are set up right up here. So they will be available today to purchase if you'd like. This morning, he's going to focus on an inside view of healthy aging. Would you please welcome Dr. Bruce McBeath? Bruce, thanks for being here.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? I was actually here several years ago. I don't know if any of you were here. It was interesting to come back here once more. And it's also interesting for me to reflect back on what I've found and what I've learned over the course of the last, over the course of the last while.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk. There's going to be a few pictures, and I'm going to ask you if you would hold questions for a while. So I'd like to have plenty of opportunity to talk with you as well. This is about we've been talking about animals, and we are now the animals, and that we'll be talking about. And particularly those of us as we get older are the animals that we'll be talking about. And I want to start with, to tell you a little bit about a person that I saw a few years back. A woman was referred to me who was just moving from a farmhouse, to a senior living residence. And she was moving under pressure from her daughter. Her daughter felt that her mother was beginning to lose it. She could no longer care for this house by herself, and she needed to be someplace else. Her daughter lived in Red Wing, so the woman who was living on a farm down closer to Rochester moved over to Red Wing and left everything else behind. Her daughter was concerned that her mother was beginning to lose her mind, that she was becoming increasingly demented. Her daughter took her mother to see a physician, her physician, and the physician evaluated her and agreed and prescribed some medication, which, by the way, the woman never took. I was asked to look at this as well because she came into the senior residence in the winter time, and within a week or so they found her in the community without her coat, and it was cold. They also found her in the hall a few times and she was lost. So I evaluated her again. I gave her some cognitive tests. I gave her some memory evaluations, and she did just terrible. So what to do? She had just moved. Well, I recommended, and it was probably the only thing I did that was useful here, was that they, rather than move her immediately to memory care, which is what they thought they might have to do, that they try to keep her there for a while to give her some sense of stability, and then begin to look for a memory care unit where she could get the kind of appropriate care she would need. They agreed. So I heard nothing further about this because another crisis trumped this crisis, and I was looking at something else, until 5 years later. I was surprised she was still there. 5 years later, I was asked if I would be willing to see her because her granddaughter was coming and staying with her. Her granddaughter was basically using her as a kind of a hostel, and she was in jeopardy of losing her lease, because that's a violation of lease in relation to HRA housing if somebody comes and stays for a long period of time who's not on the registry. So she had agreed to see me, and here she comes, now 90 years old, coming in with her walker. She looked like she did when she was 85. And we spoke about her granddaughter staying with her. She said to me, "This is very hard," she said. "It's so hard for me to have to whittle down my love." And I thought that was the case. I agreed, that was true, that it was very difficult to set boundaries on this young woman. But she also agreed that her allowing the granddaughter to stay with her had not been helpful to the granddaughter. So she said that she was reluctant, but that she would in fact do that. She would in fact keep the stays short. And then, having completed our business, I said, Ruth, do you remember when you were here 5 years ago?" "Oh, yes," she said. She said, "That was a terrible time." She said, "I hated it every single day. I hated to move." I said, "Ruth, you remember how concerned we were about your memory?" She said, "Oh," she said, "I can't remember anything." She said, "My memory is terrible." I said, "What do you mean?" "Well," she said, "just last week, Thursday, I came back from the dining hall and I got all the way back to my apartment before I realized I had left my purse on the table, and I had to go all the way back and pick it up so I could open my apartment. My memory is awful." Okay. I heard nothing further about it. The issue with the granddaughter was resolved. And then just last February, a year ago February, her name came back up again because Ruth had generated some balance problems. She'd had some falls. They were very concerned about her safety, and they had arranged to help her move to an assisted living facility in Rochester where she had a sister who was also in residence. So, 9 years after we have agreed this woman has significant memory problems and cannot live independently, 9 years later, she has to move to assisted living. What in the world was going on? Well, I want to talk with you about what in the world is going on and what in the world is going on with the whole field as we begin to understand more about the whole field of aging. Here's a good piece of what's going on. The lies we're told about being old. We are told that aging implies deterioration and pathology, that basically aging is a diagnosis and aging is a disease. That, in fact, all of our personality functions inevitably decline as a consequence of aging. Now, I learned this in graduate school, that they do in fact decline. Thinking, feeling, sensation, intuition, all of it deteriorates. And that this perspective, which is the perspective that was held when Ruth came in for her evaluation, is a perspective that's shared across the board. The medical community operates like this, and by the way, it's gotten better. However, I hate to say it, but it's still more true than not true, even though there is significant improvement here. That this is the belief system of the medical community. Commercial enterprises, human services operate on the declinist model, and so does our educational system by and large. The older we become, the more stupid, miserable, and fragile we become. Now, we could say, well, okay, so they don't really understand, so we're really wrong about aging, or we have bad ideas about it, so what? Well, I want to tell you, there is a huge so what. The beliefs on what we believe about aging and its impact on longevity is striking. In fact, we know that it carries an impact. What we believe about aging affects our longevity by an average of 7.5 years, which is to say, if you believe the declinist perspective that everything goes to hell as you get older, if you believe that, you are likely impacting your longevity by 7.5 years. Now, how big a deal is that? Well, it's a bigger deal than any other single factor. So, what you believe about aging is more important than your sex, than your socioeconomic status, than your actual physical functional health. If you have a chronic condition, you are more likely across the board to live longer than if you believe in the declinist perspective about aging. And loneliness. Loneliness is a big factor. It's a huge factor. However, it is not more significant than what you believe about aging in terms of its actual impact on your longevity. Now, you don't have to pay a lot of attention to these because I use these for other things, and I didn't know whether the setup would work for slides here. Basically, to get to the point of this, we have done tests now, interesting tests, and I put the ones that I think are most interesting up, where what we've done is had people in controlled studies where we've done testing measures to see that everybody's IQ is about the same roughly everybody's cognitive function is good, and everybody's in about the same age range. In this case, in this particular study, they were all between 60 and 72. And then we do some testing. We find out what they believe about aging, for one thing, and how they categorize themselves. So if I believe that everything goes downhill as I'm older, and I'm told that I'm older, then how do I do when you give me some kind of test? Or if I'm the same age as you, if we're both the same age, but I am told that I'm the younger, and I have a belief about younger, then how do I do? Well, we find that, if we cut to the chase, we find that if you believe that you will decline as you get older, and if you're told that you're in an older group, that is enough to increase your odds of being screened and diagnosed for dementia. You will be screened and diagnosed for dementia. Your odds will increase by 400%. So think about that the next time you go to see a physician in a clinical office and they want to screen you for dementia. What are your odds of being seen as demented? Well, they're actually very, very good. Now, one of the things that happens, of course, with this declinist view is it promotes the notion that we need to stay young, doesn't it? That's the idea. Don't get old. I mean, if you're gonna come apart when you get old, well, my God, don't get old. Well, we have a whole industry which is based on these attempts to keep people from getting old. And it isn't just women. Getting you back in the game. So you can see there's a lot of stuff in our culture that is entirely dependent upon the belief that as we get older, we simply come apart. Now let's look at what the reality is. What's the truth here? Well, we know, from a psychological perspective, we know that what we call crystallized intelligence, that basically means the stuff that got measured with you when you did IQ testing. And you were in, elementary school? Did you get IQ testing? Or maybe when you get into college or whatever, you had some kind of IQ test, some kind of placement test they did. Those basic scores and where you stand in relation to those scores basically stays consistent over the course of your life. So if you were in a particular range when you were in let's say in elementary or in adolescence, perhaps young adult, certainly young adult, and you're tested again at an older age, say in your 70s or 80s, you're likely to be in that same category. So we know that basic intelligence remains about the same, more or less, throughout the lifespan. Where we run into difficulty with this is that something called fluid or novel problem solving scores change, and they are basically on the decline as you get older. However, we have to look into what this actually means. And we know that older people, I'm in this group with you, we don't do as well when the pressure's on in a time test. We don't do as well when the clock is on us. And then there are a variety of reasons for that, which we can talk about if you want to later on. However, if you take the clock off and if you take people out of the laboratory and put them in a real life situation, what happens then? What happens in real life in terms of a person's problem solving ability as they get older? Well, let me tell you about Carl. Carl's a 78-year-old guy. He's a farmer. He lives down by Durand. And if you know anything about the country around Durand, you know it's kind of like little, Switzerland or something. It's very hilly. And one day, one summer morning, Carl decides on a Sunday morning that he's going to stop by a barn, which he has, and check the ventilator on a silo. And he has an extension ladder there, and it's propped up against the hillside, and he can move it over against a brace, and he can climb up. So he stops his vehicle, he's just driving his car, and he jumps out, and he gets on the ladder, and he climbs up to the top of the barn to check the ventilator on a silo. And while he's up there, just very quickly, the wind kicks up, as it tends to do around here, and there goes the ladder. And here's Carl, 30 plus feet off the ground on a barn roof. And what does he do? Well, he's wearing a long sleeve shirt. He's got a pair of old raggedy jeans, and he doesn't have any socks. He's got a pair of old tennis shoes, all holey tennis shoes. Importantly, he just put new laces in them. So here's what Carl does. He takes off his shirt, he ties it, takes off his pants, he ties the shirt and the pants together, he takes his car key and he wedges against the seam of the jeans a little hole. And he feeds the laces into that hole, and he connects the laces into the toes of each of the two shoes. So basically he's got two shoes like this now on the bottom of the jeans. He ties the shirt to the brace that the ladder was against, and of course then he begins to come back down, the shirt to the jeans, grabs a hold of one shoe, holds it for a moment, it catches the other shoe, and drops with the laces down, bringing him about 5 feet above the ground. He lets go and drops down. He figured he was going to be close enough to make it. Drops down and he makes it, and now he's on the ground. So, and of course, there he is now, sitting on the ground with his skivvies. And he is not too concerned about this because he knows that he has a pair of coveralls in the trunk of his car. But his car key, he's not too concerned about that either, since he's got a key in a magnetic container against the engine block. So the car's unlocked, he flips the hood. He's leaning over the hood. You can imagine this, as Carl is now draped over the hood. And things are going pretty well until he hears a car coming up behind him. And he hears the voice of his neighbor, they're coming back from church, whose wife is sitting next to him chuckling, they're laughing. And the neighbor says, "Carl," he says, "is it warm enough for you?" So there we have problem solving, real problem solving. Older people do very, very well. We run into concerns sometimes about memory. Our ideas about memory are shifting. And as we learn more and do more research, we're beginning to now understand that we actually have memory files located in various parts of our brain. They're not all in one place. And it's not all in the hippocampus, which we had imagined it might be. They're stored in various places. And as we have more memory files, we are beginning to understand it sometimes takes us a little longer to get to the right one. And so if we're a little slower tracking, it's because usually there's simply a lot more there. Here's a stereotype. The first senior moment. The very idea of senior moments. Now, these are funny, and I bring them in for that purpose, but I want us to recognize that we, in a way, do ourselves a disservice when we talk about having senior moments. Because actually, when your 5 or 6-year-old or 7-year-old grandchild is leaving home and his or her mother says, "Hey, Where's your homework? Where's your lunch? You don't have your lunch. You don't even have your mittens. The little kid does not say, oh my God, I'm losing my mind. And yet, we understand that memory for all of us throughout the lifespan is a function of selective attention, that we're paying attention. And memory does not do well, memory for anybody does not do well when they are not attentive. And that is just as true for elementary school children, for adolescents. My God, talk about memory issues. With the raging hormones and the shift that's going on in the physical structure and metabolism and all the rest of it. Memory is an issue of selective attention throughout the lifespan. And the idea of a senior moment, What about the idea that we are miserable, that we are increasingly miserable as we're older? Well, this one has been researched for a long time. Laura Carstensen, who's a Stanford researcher, has been working with memory issues and studying memory for over 20 years. And the results time over time are, not studying memory, studying the emotional maturity and emotional satisfaction, happiness, that kind of thing, for over 20 years. The results are very consistent here, that we, in fact, those of us that are older, do better emotionally than any other age group. Our emotional life is more satisfactory when you measure it through any kind of deep evaluation than any other age group. My God, we look at adolescence and we understand something about what that emotional life is like. But in fact, middle-aged adults do much less well than do we. There's also, and I indicate that here, an increase in complexity and poignancy with advancing age. This is a very interesting area for those of us in the shrink business, because the very idea of putting emotions together like that, to have an emotion that you'd call poignancy, well, there's a bit of sadness, there's a sense of sadness that's mixed in with joy. I have this experience of feeling like it's just a very rich kind of sadness that also feels delightful at times. It would be like thinking about a dog, thinking about the talk this morning, about a dog I had that died a few years ago now, and I love that dog, a big German Shepherd dog. And I can feel my sadness about his loss, and I can feel the joy I had in having him with me. We would call that poignancy. Now, if you talk to younger people, they have no sense of poignancy. They get sadness, they get joy, but that idea of bittersweet, that experience of bittersweet, they don't have it in their life. It comes with the process of getting older. Social reasoning improves. In fact, we're beginning to learn that social reasoning improves so much that there are certain kinds of jobs and roles in our culture that should be held by older people. They should be, because they're the best able to do it. And here we have, for example, legal decisions, counseling, intergroup negotiations. I think about Congress. I don't know. We do have some older people in Congress. I don't know. They went off the skid somewhere, some of them. But there is that sense that there is an increasing capacity to hold a more complex picture of anything in an older person than in any other age group. Back to the stereotype. That older people just don't get it, you know. No, that's not the case. It's simply not the case. I mean, we have fun with it. We laugh about it. The point is that we do not allow this to come in as a truth. This is a caricature, and there are older people like that because there are, and we'll talk about the individuality of older people in just a little bit. But this is, by and large, the opposite of what's true with older people. All right. Our struggle to try to understand what is wisdom is about understanding aging, understanding the heart coming together with the mind. Part 2, the lies we're told. The idea here is that our culture has been so constructed for so long about a particular stereotype of aging that it does whatever it can to hold on to it. And here we're talking about the commercial industry, the commercial enterprises that make basically profitability has to do with selling products. And so we continue to advance a kind of competitive orientation which might fit younger people and might fit the marketplace for younger people at certain points, but in fact is increasingly out of kilter with people as they get older. So, for example, this is not my term. This is Bill Thomas's term, a writer, a gerontologist, and writer about aging. The history of efficiency porn. Efficiency porn. Things are measured by how efficient you are. And it is increasingly, and it's pornographic because it is increasingly objectifying you. I am as good as how fast I can get something done. That's what makes it efficiency porn. I'm as good as how quickly I can get something done. Well, that begins to become a criteria for measuring everything, and Thomas's notion here is that it never, ever stops. So, if we look at development, in the lifespan of development, what you notice is that in childhood, we have an emphasis on being and not so much on doing. In other words, it's an opportunity to explore yourself, to feel like what it's like to be in the world, to learn a few things, but mostly it's the sense is when you come home, and you may remember this from your childhood, and your mother asks you, what did you do today? And you say, nothing. Well, what was that nothing? Well, I don't know. I walked around in the woods. I watched a squirrel for a while. I made a dam in the creek. I got together with a couple of friends, and we dug through a couple of garbage cans, whatever we did. But it wasn't about doing. It was about being. You get that distinction? Because that distinction begins to get lost. In adulthood, we make a very decided shift, and we become very much about doing. And here's where becoming successful and achieving and being accomplished and all the rest of it becomes very important. However, there is in our natural development a shift back to time and space to simply be with myself and other people that I like and hang out in a natural place if I can, a shift back to being. But that, in our culture, has been lost. Even it has been lost with childhood. If you can read that, where the little girl says to her father, skip to the part where the princess climbs to the top of the corporate ladder. Where even our children are programmed to be successful while they are supposed to be children. It's a big, as you know, it's a big problem. And now the development cycle looks like this, where we have this rather malignant enlargement of adulthood that bleeds its way right into older life. And when do you get off the chain? Well, never. Back to the stereotypes. The idea that we need to avoid this period of our life because it's terrible. Because our bodies won't be any good for anything. And that, of course, is a continuation of the malignant enlargement of adulthood. So I think I'm going to skip through this and say something about how do we know what is true on the inside as we get older beyond the testing that I've talked about, beyond the intellectual testing, beyond the emotional maturity, these indices of wisdom. How do we know what older people actually experience that tells us that there's something here that's going on that's different that we did not and that we don't know much about, that we simply don't know much about, that the development of a person continues until they die. Development doesn't stop at 20 or 21 or 25 or 30 or 40. Development does not stop. Even neural growth, we know now, does not stop until a person dies. Well, if we are always developing, then what is the nature of the experience of living when you're in your 60s, later in your 60s, in your 70s, in your 80s, and beyond? What is the experience? We know it's different. We know it's different because we've already developed, we've already known what it's like to become increasingly mature, but how does maturity look when maturity is beyond where we already are? When we begin to understand that as people have lived relatively healthy, how does maturity look and feel? That was an intriguing question for a Swedish sociologist, Lars Tornstam, who spent 25 years looking at that very thing. How does maturity look? And he did in-depth investigations in Sweden, and then they moved to Germany, and then they did them in the United States, and in Malaysia, and in Australia, and the results were the same over and over and over again. And I put them in terms of tendencies, because this does not mean that everybody is like this, but it means that more people are than not. About 2/3 in his research. About 2/3 of all older people, 60s, 70s, 80s, into their 90s, and I think some of them were 100 and up to about 105. What happened? Well, we find that they began to feel differently and think differently about their childhood. They began to take childhood back differently than it had been held before. There is an increasing connection to earlier generations. That as people get older, and I know this myself directly, I should, if these things are true, I should be experiencing it myself, and I do, that my attachment to my parents, particularly my father, who's been dead for 25 years, is increasing. I have a more of a sense of him now than I did after he'd been dead 10 years. I find this is not at all uncommon about those of us as we get older, that we begin to feel closer to the lives of people who we were close to who went before us. Fear of life and death. The fear of death disappears. That's generally true. Older people generally are a whole lot more concerned about other things than the fact that they're going to die. Younger people, it scares the death out of them, and middle-aged people have the hardest time of all with this. They just hate it. In fact, the whole life insurance industry is sort of dependent upon that. The mystery in life, the sense of life as a mystery. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't completely know what's going to happen next in my life. Becomes more acceptable with aging, with healthy aging. More acceptable. The grand events to subtle experiences, what we're talking about here is how sometimes walking out of the house across the yard is a sublime experience in terms of what a person notices that they had failed to notice before. The power of advancing slowness and attention is that we notice things. Much younger people, like our grandchildren, pick up on this pretty easily because it is they that come often to us and want to talk to us or spend time with us. Why? Well, they care about us, sure, but we are also paying attention. They may very well have parents who are in the fraught experience of middle-aged life, busy, 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 and they try to pay attention, but you know when you're talking with them that their mind is someplace else. But not us. As we get older, we are increasingly right where we are. And it is the biggest time in life when that is most true. I have a colleague who has for years meditated, as I do, and he said, Bruce, do you think that that there's an advantage to being a meditator as you get older? And I said, well, from what I understand and from my own experience, actually aging is an experience in increasing meditation. So that meditation, the experience of meditation, becomes a natural experience increasingly as we age. Will we all be Buddhists? Are we? Well, we certainly have those capacities. We could say that about the Christian traditions as well, the contemplatives. Will we become contemplatives? Yes. Yes, we will. We are increasingly contemplative, naturally. Decrease in the people, one of the stereotypes is that older people are increasingly self-centered. Absolutely wrong. Absolutely wrong. With healthy aging, there is a decrease in self-centeredness. Now, we probably all know people. We probably all know people who that's not true. Because, as I said, this fits maybe 2/3 of the population, more people than not. However, generally speaking, there is a decrease in self-centeredness. There's the development of body transcendence. We find this with some of the exercise programs that depend on people exercising their way into continued health. You know, if you exercise 5 hours a day, 8 must be better. Well, unfortunately, the research suggests that about 5 hours a week spent right is actually very, very good. The individual realizes that pieces of life jigsaw form a wholeness, and that there is an increasing sense of tranquility and solitude. Older people's need for increasing solitude is remarkable. It's one of the problems we've had in training people in care institutions not to see people as depressed if they want to spend time by themselves. Because spending time by ourselves becomes increasingly precious, just as spending time with people close to us. Where's the butter? I think you should really be watching your cholesterol. I'm 92 years old. I've done everything that I care to do in this life except one, to eat this muffin. Right, you are. Where's the butter? I want to say a little bit about gratitude and generosity, because gratitude and generosity are two of the characteristics that seem to be particularly notable as we age in the process of healthy aging. There is an increase in gratitude and an increase in generosity. And sometimes people will misunderstand and say, well, of course you can be grateful because you've lived a blessed life. You've had good fortune. Well, let me tell you about Marilyn. Marilyn was older when she had her fourth child. She was I think she was early 40s when she had her fourth child. And it was a son who was born with profound, he was paraplegic, and he had some profound medical complications, and it required an awful lot of medical intervention, and they thought he would probably die before he was an adolescent. She had 3 other children who were healthy. Marilyn worked hard at her marriage. Her husband was a relentless alcoholic, and she finally, very reluctantly, divorced him. So now she's alone with 3 children, healthy, 1 child who needs an awful lot of care. And that child did not die in adolescence. That child, in fact, lived to be about 40 years old. And Marilyn continued to work and devote time to his care, and then he died. When she came to see me, she was 82, and she was still grieving his loss and wanted to talk it through with me, which we did. And Marilyn was this bright, bubbly person. She sewed scarves for people and gave them away. She thought somebody needed something that she could sew or knit. She did it. She was a part of her church, active in her church. She was also active in a couple social organizations. Just a bubbly, bright person. When she was about 85, she was visiting with her son, and this was shortly after the death of her son's oldest daughter. A son lived in the area around Decorah, but the daughter had gone to California to go to college and had been riding in a car with 5 other students, and the car was hit by a semi, and 3 of the 5 died, including her granddaughter. So now she lost a son, she lost a granddaughter. She went to visit the son, her son, whose daughter that was, in Decorah, and they were driving from where they had been visiting back to his house, and she was driving the car just to drop him back home before she headed back up here, this area, and she hit a spot of ice, and the car spun around and it went off the road and landed on its side. So gratefully other cars saw it happen. They called the emergency service people, and they came out, and they had to extract her. It was easy to extract her. They could reach in and grab her, but they had to cut through the car to extract him. And there was some real concern about whether he would make it or not. And she had broken her arm, she'd broken her leg, she had some cracked vertebrae. She was in bad shape too, but he was in worse shape. Well, he did make it. They had him in the hospital there. I think he was in Mayo for a while. She was transported to Mayo for a while herself, and then went through a long period of recovery, at the end of which, or toward the end of which, she asked if I would see her, and she wanted to talk with me now about not just her grief, but the tremendous guilt that she was feeling about, and she, in her sense, having been responsible for almost killing her son because she was driving the car. And we worked that through. We worked with it for a while. Her religious orientation was very helpful here in terms of forgiveness. And she became, again, this bubbly, cheerful person, this woman who'd gone through loss after loss after loss, and now has some pain in her body that she didn't have before as a consequence of the accident. Now she's back to sewing and knitting, and now she's back to giving scarves to people. And she says, and she will say it to pretty much anybody who talks to her about this, she'll say, you know, I'm so glad to be here. I am just so glad to be in this life. So does luck have to do with this? That increasing sense that we are in the practice of gratitude each day seems a part of the process of healthy aging. is also a process of increasing individuality. We are increasingly unique and increasingly different as we get older. I think it's worth noting that there is no age group that is more different than older people. No age group. If you want people who are more like each other, then look at children. In spite of their very differentness, they are more alike than we are. Look at middle-aged adults. Middle-aged adults are much more alike, more like each other than we are. That our increasing uniqueness becomes a part of the process of aging, particularly as we're able to make contact with it and find some way of bringing it into expression through programs like this one. My dad just wants to be treated with a little respect and dignity in his old age. Don't worry, we're used to dealing with troublemakers at this home. You want a little respect and dignity in your old age? This Robin Wipperling, who was the program developer for the Red Wing Senior Center for all the time I was connected, and is a wonderful photographer, and I put a book together. And we did it out of the writing that I had been doing and then the photography that she put together to try to capture this experience of getting older and what helps us on the personal path. That aging is a process of continuing development and requires our active participation. What can we do to help ourselves in this process? We make space for inner reflection. We understand that we are changing. We are not just changing physically, we're changing mentally. Our perceptions are becoming different, and our experiencing is becoming different. This is an ongoing gardening project. We need to pay attention to the differentness that shows up in us, because it is like tender shoots in a garden. And we can stamp down our own impulses, be they artistic or creative or generative in relation to being with another person. Whatever they are, we can cut them off with some middle-aged talk, let me call it, like, oh, I don't have time for that kind of foolishness. Right? How are you going to make any money doing that? Tending this new plant that's growing in us. To be emphatic in our developing slowness. We remember that slowness inspires attention and is a prerequisite to an increased capacity to be present. We are more available, we have more capacity to be present than any other age group. And it may very well be why we are here at all. Why do we have old people? It isn't so we can have more children. And it isn't so we can make more money. Why? Is it so that we can show what maturity looks like? That we can show up for other people in ways that they and younger people cannot yet do? So we can reflect an image of what a life can look like that's attentive and caring and compassionate. Those do seem to be essential qualities of aging. Residing in elderhood, we're increasing masters of attention, of presence, of depth, essential qualities that are vital, but unfortunately solely lacking in our contemporary culture, and that's what we bring. And now I want to invite your comments or questions for a few minutes before we need to stop. those of you who speak.
I think one of my greatest pleasures is the fact that I can now concentrate on my grandchildren. My youngest granddaughter, every time I'm with her, she says, "Grammy, tell me about when you were little. Tell me about your sister." And it's such a pleasure for me that she's interested in me, because my other two are 13 and 17. Well, they're off and running. So I am
They may very well be back. I've had that experience too, and I've also had the experience of the return as they got into their 20s and wanted to talk about some very interesting things that I was interested in, but they could not find other adults that were. So they may very well be back, but I hear what you're saying about that. Thank you. Yes?
What do you think about bridge and games and playing these games like Sudoku or whatever to improve your brain? Does that help?
Sure. Anything that you do, this is sort of the brain health question. Anything that you do that stretches you, that's the key. The key is that it stretches you. So it turns out that there is no one thing here. There's no one particular mental activity. You don't have to do crossword puzzles unless you like to do them. If you like to do them, make sure that you're doing them that are more difficult. Sudoku is fine if you like to do it. If you don't like to do it, don't do it. If you do it, then see that the level of difficulty increases, and that goes with everything. So if you play a musical instrument and you know 5 chords like I did on the guitar, at age 18 I knew 5 chords, and when I hit 70 I could play those 5 chords not as well. So it's increasing difficulty that's the key, because it is increasing difficulty that stimulates neural activity and neural growth. And gardening, sewing, dancing. Dancing is particularly good because you got your whole body involved in it. But any activity, if you can increase the level of difficulty in something that you already like, so that your feelings are helping you here. I love to do this, and that's kind of the motto. I love to do this, and it's hard. That's the motto. I love to do it, and it's hard. If you can do it, find stuff that fits that. That'll keep your brain growing. Yes.
I think I only knew one of my grandmas, no other ones. And I think of the grandmas and the great-grandmas and the grandpas and the great-grandpas that my children have, and the grandchildren and everything. And I think it's just great when these little kids come up, and it's great for me too.
It can be, can it? It can be a real feast, a feast of maturity available to younger people.
Well, I have that quote that says, if I knew how fun grandkids have been, I would have had this first.
Yes, that's true. Anything else? Yes, ma'am.
As I got older, it seemed like it was a trap of aging that sucked you in, because if you didn't want to do something, you had an excuse. You were older. And it scared me, because it would be very easy to fall into that, get sucked into it. And therefore, we cannot use the excuse of aging. I don't enjoy senior jokes, except now, what happened, and it was to a young relative of mine who was a senior in high school. That's the real senior joke, okay? It's not us. But it's a scary thing how you can lose these years of opportunity by getting sucked into that. It's just really scary.
Well, you're talking about being sucked into a kind of isolation, withdrawal and isolation. And those are characteristics of what I would refer to as unhealthy aging that ends up with loneliness. We know that the big killers are loneliness, boredom, if you're not attending to life, basically, because life keeps showing up, Loneliness and boredom are great killers of older people, and we do need to pay attention. We know that we're going to be suffering losses. I was talking about Marilyn, and Marilyn is an example of what I would refer to as aging whole. Aging whole means we age right along with our aches, our pains, and the losses we will all experience, unless, of course, we become the loss for the others. So it's very important that we continue to hold the whole. I think the point here is that the process of aging naturally allows us increasingly to do that, partly because we have lost some of the inhibitions that are socially prescribed inhibitions. Tornstam refers to that in the material I had up just a minute ago. He calls it emancipated innocence. Emancipated innocence. And that basically is covered in the notion that as I grow old, I'll wear purple. You know, as I grow old, I'll wear what I want to wear. If I want to spend time with you, I will spend time with you. I'll be polite. I'll be compassionate. If our relationship is pretty superficial, I may not spend much time. My mother, I remember, had a friend, I thought, of a friend. She saw this woman every year, or no, she saw her several times a year. And I asked her at one point, toward the end of my mother's life, if she had seen that friend. And she said, I really don't want to spend that much time with her. We find we really don't have that much in common to talk about. And my mother was very social and loved being with people. But she became more discriminating about how she spent her time. And that is characteristic. We want more close connections, more heartfelt connections. Not so many people pulling on us.
I think of the phrase, take time to smell the roses.
Mm-hmm.
That sure applies to me, because now that I'm retired, I love gardening, I have a porch, and I can just sit and smell the flowers, watch the birds, and it's a joy to me because for 55 years I worked and I had that pressure of watching the clock, so I really, really enjoy my life now.
Enjoying our life and sharing that enjoyment with other people. We'll take one more and then I think we'll stop. Yes, ma'am.
I was curious if you would talk a little bit more about gratitude as a healing, as part of wellness, and how gratitude works in that.
Yeah, it's important. I think it's important to remember that gratitude is a discipline, not a stroke of luck. Gratitude is a practice. I think Marilyn's life examples that. Gratitude is a practice. We show up practicing gratitude. And so we are available for appreciation. And we are available for appreciation even in the midst of pain and suffering. Sometimes the pain and suffering captures our attention, like somebody near us dies. We lose a spouse, or a sibling, or even a beloved animal. And we are overcome with the pain. And then there is the discipline of noticing what else shows up. That we pay attention to what else shows up. We pay attention to the memories of the time with that person. We pay attention to the love we feel around that person. We pay attention to how we show up differently in our life now because of that person and their gift to us that we are now enacting in our own life. So that taking life back into the whole, bringing it back into the whole, is what healing actually, in terms of etymology, is what healing actually means. Healing means coming back to the whole. That's the definition of the word. And that is what happens with the practice of gratitude. And with that, I want to say I'm grateful to be with you this morning, and I think, and I want to suggest you take a look at our book. I think it's really good and addresses these concerns as we move through aging. And I think we're going to be moving toward lunch. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yes, thank you, Dr. Bruce McBeath. Very, very interesting. Thank you for being here. And again, yeah, check out the books up here at the table anytime, and you might want to take one home with you. Couple reminders again. Our concert with Caitlin Smith, May 16th at the Cannon Falls High School Auditorium. Maggie Chapman will be the opening act, and then Caitlin will perform after her. We do have tickets available. Don't delay, though, because they are going fast. If you want them today, you can check with me or Dick or one of the board members to get your tickets. Senior softball kicks off on May 5th, 10 a.m. at Archie Swenson Field number 1. We got our Nashville trip coming up, our San Antonio, Texas trip coming up. Information on those trips on the back table. 500, we'll be playing 500 on Monday, May 4th, 12:30 to 3 p.m. So keep all of those things in mind. Again, thanks to our speakers today, Mike and Bruce. Appreciate it. Give them both a round of applause again. They did a great job. And again, we're going to have our next Adventures in Learning June 26th, and we'll be at Eastside Park, and that's going to be, I think, a really, really fun one too.